And over to Jenny.
Well, thank you so much, Kelsey, and hello to everyone. It's great to be here this afternoon. Welcome to our 2022 Research for the Public Good. This is our internal APUS conference that we do annually to promote research at the university and to recognize a lot of the great work that's being done. This afternoon, what we're looking at is just a fairly compact session that's focused particularly on some common questions and issues around survey research. And I'm going to say right up front, I am not a survey research methodologist, although I find it very interesting. So if one of you is a survey research methodologist or really loves that area, we'd love to tap your expertise for future sessions, because this is really an area that we have a lot of faculty and students who are interested in doing survey research. And really the origin of this session was that through our Human Subjects Review Board, the IRB, we see a lot of requests for survey research. And there tend to be certain common themes that emerge when we're looking at those survey requests for things that maybe just don't quite match up right, or that could be done more successfully to produce a better research study, and especially in survey design, because it is very tricky to think about doing that in a way that makes sense. So what I'm going to do is talk about some things that we typically see when we're looking at surveys through the IRB. And we have Priscilla, Coulter here and Colleen Neary from the libraries. And as we get closer to the end, they're going to introduce a new resource that they have created to provide more background and a way to help you and your students as you're thinking about producing a survey for research purposes. So one of the first things that we often see, especially from the IRB perspective, is does that survey align with the idea of the research question that's being proposed? And I know for all of us, really, sometimes coming up with a good research question and then thinking about the right design and methodology to answer that question is some of the most challenging part of the research process. So sometimes we see research questions up in the IRB application, and then when we get to the survey, we're like, I'm not really sure if I see the connection here between what's being asked up here and then what's the content of the survey down here. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples as we're going that might seem a little bit silly, but just for demonstration purposes. So let's say somebody writes it up in the IRB application. Their research question is, are Americans concerned about rising ocean levels? Well, first of all, that's a yes/no question. So sometimes that presents a problem with a research question if it's a yes/no answer. But then when you think about a survey, if you use a term like Americans, then, well, who are you really talking about? You know, is it a specific demographic? Is it a location that you're interested in? An age group, etc. Who's the population? And then when you get into something like a survey research, you have to think about a subjective term like concerned. Well, how are you going to define the notion of concern and ask questions about it in the context of a survey, if that makes most sense? So sometimes there's a little mismatch there that it's hard to determine if the survey questions are really getting at that research question. So for example, someone might then narrow it down and say, to what extent are residents living in the greater Miami area preparing for property loss or damage due to rising ocean levels? And then maybe their questions would, have a specific narrower participant pool, and also then be able to ask them about actions or specific aspects of that event. So the first question is, what does the research question look like? And is the survey the best way to answer it? And do those match? So what I have on this slide is not an exhaustive list, but these are some common things that when we're looking at survey questions and survey design, it's amazingly complex, all of the thought and preparation that has to go into creating a survey. So I'm going to give you some examples here of of these elements of question design that you may want to think about when you're designing a survey. And there are a lot of resources that we'll point to at the end that can give you some more in-depth information about how to go about this. So in the question wording, having very clear, simple wording is important for questioning. And sometimes the wording of a question being positive versus negative can make a big difference in the interpretation of it for the participant. So as an example, if someone asked, to what extent do you support the zoning policy about chickens in the city? Since our neighbors have chickens, I always think about that. So that's a question that might be a Likert scale from not at all to completely, something like that. Versus what if someone asks the question, to what extent do you not want chickens within city limits? It's a little bit harder for people to conceptualize a negative answer, because if you say agree, am I agreeing that I don't want them, or am I agreeing that I do want them? It becomes a little bit more complicated there to interpret. The question order, all of us have experienced that kind of how the question is presented in the order of the questions can make a big difference about the context in which the respondent is answering them. So if you had something, and this again, a little exaggerated, but let's say you had an agree, disagree scale where you said mothers are key to healthy families. And that was an item. And then all mothers should have access to free healthcare. Well, the question before might sort of predispose people to think about how they answer the question after. If you create a very positive feeling around mothers and healthy families, then you have to think about how that might impact the next thing you're asking, which is a very different issue about maybe access to healthcare. So those are considerations when you're designing a survey, is how you're positioning the questions and whether that's creating on purpose or not on purpose a certain way of helping the respondents to work through. Likert scales, our favorite things. So these are the scales that you use when you're trying to say to what extent, and they can be from not at all, to completely, or strongly disagree to strongly agree, those kind of scales. Some of the things we see with Likert scales, sometimes people inadvertently ask a yes or no question. So if you ask, do you like ice cream? From strongly disagree to strongly agree, it doesn't really fit. It doesn't match up with the scale that you're asking. So if you put in a yes no question with the Likert scale, it sort of confuses people, because they're like, I don't know what you're asking me to tell you. Sometimes the Likert scale, you have to think about how many items are in it. How many, it's a 3-point scale, a 4-point scale, a 5-point scale, etc. So for instance, like if you asked, how often do you brush your teeth? Sometimes, always, never. That might be useful information, but if you're really trying to figure out how many days a week or how many times a day, then that might not be the scale that you're looking to use to get that information. Also, like with the question wording, be careful of negative wording. So if you have a controversial issue or really any issue, for example, what if we said, without background checks, Americans should not be allowed to purchase firearms? Whoa. I mean, how would you say agree or disagree to that statement? Because are you agreeing they shouldn't? Are you agreeing they should? Are you agreeing they should have background checks? Are you agreeing they should not? It's really hard to decipher what the scale is for. So Likert scales can be beautiful, but the items have to be worded very clearly to make them work. Double-barreled questions, going down to the bottom left. This is just the tendency that all of us have to ask more than one thing in the same question occasionally. So for instance, if you asked, to what extent do you approve of your child's education in reading and math? it might be hard for people to answer because maybe they feel great about the reading, but terrible about the math. And they don't know how to balance those two things. So a double barrel question just means you're trying to pack too much in the same question. You might need to unpack it and create different questions. Cognitive load, this one is fun for me to think about. It really just means how many steps, mental steps, does a person have to do in order to answer the question that you're asking? And most people, if you're asked to take a survey, you want it to be quick, because you just want to get through it. And if you have too many mental steps to do, you might just stop, or you're just going to guess. So here's a funny example that I thought. So if you wanted to ask, how many hours did you spend blow drying your hair in the last month? Well, to answer that, you might have to think, how many times did I blow dry my hair last week? Okay, how many times is that in a month? How long did it take per time? And then how do I calculate that in hours? So you see what I mean? If there's too many steps, then people are going to be like, oh, I don't know, let's just say 12, because I can't get to that number without thinking really hard. So that's something that might deter people from answering the question. And sometimes it's just, there's too many assumptions when we're writing the question, and people get stuck on what we're actually asking. And open-ended questions, so sometimes people want to do a survey, but they want more qualitative data. So they're asking an open-ended question in the hopes that they're going to get more rich text responses so that they can do some text analysis from the survey. Again, sometimes people inadvertently ask yes or no questions. So if you ask, do you think you're at risk of identity theft? The answer could easily be yes or no. And what the researcher might be intending is why or why not, or to what extent or what activities might put a person at risk. So it's just important, if you're trying to get a larger text response, to design the question to really get what you want. So stop me if you want to ask questions in the chat or make a comment on any of these. These are just areas that are part of that art and science of survey design that are more tricky than you think when you set out to write a survey. And I've experienced that even in just what seems like a very simple survey task needs several pairs of eyes and some vetting and going through the process. I'm going to say a couple of things about participants. This is a huge topic in itself, and there's a lot of literature on sampling and participant pools. So from a sampling perspective, one of the things we see in the IRB a lot is where we ask, how many participants do you think you're going to have in this research study? And in a survey, some of that sample size depends on what tests you think you might be wanting to run. Are you looking for certain correlations, or do you need a certain sample size to be able to run the stats test you're thinking about in order to get to an answer that has some statistical validity to it? And that's where I know it gets pretty tricky for a lot of us that don't have a ton of stats background. If you weren't here for Sage Research Methods earlier today, when we post that video, go back and watch it, because there's the great Which Stats Test resource that you can look at there. So those are some things that come into play, because sometimes people will say, oh, I'm going to survey and I'm going to get 10 people. Well, I don't know. Does that help you if you're going to get 10 people in the survey to answer the question or perform the test that you think you might need? Another part of that is who is being surveyed, the representativeness of the sample. So we tend to get a lot of requests, or a fair number, that say, I'm going to put this out on social media and I'm hoping that I'll get, X number of people to take the survey. That might be okay for the type of question that's being asked, but it's important to consider whether that's the right sample for the study. If that's representative enough, do you need a certain number of people who have certain characteristics in order to actually get data that makes sense for what you're trying to do? So that's just something to think about as you're designing the survey and the study in general. Is what are you looking to analyze to answer that question, and then who would need to take that survey and how many in order to get you where you want to go. From a risk perspective, and this is more the IRB hat, so in the IRB we say, how do you minimize risk, any risk to participants? One of those areas of risk is in revealing a lot of demographic information, and especially in the current age of data privacy, with some of the newer laws that have been enacted, it can be very tricky if you're asking a lot of different demographic information, especially if it's things like political party or marital status or sexual orientation or even age or pay. Can be very sensitive for people to answer, even if you think the survey can't be traced back to the individual. So when you're building out that survey, sometimes it's tempting to say, oh, I'm going to ask every demographic I can think of because it might be useful later. That's not always a great strategy from a privacy perspective. So really think about what do you need to know about those people for your analysis. Is the survey really anonymous or is it confidential? That's an IRB terminology. It's only anonymous if the researcher truly has no idea who completed the survey and cannot trace the responses back to any individual person. It's confidential if you are sending it to a limited group of people and you know who all those people are, and you may or may not be able to guess who submitted it. That's more like a confidential thing because you're just not going to reveal who took the survey, but it's not completely anonymous in that case. So just be aware of the difference between those two. We oftentimes talk about triggering questions. So because of the disciplines we have at the university, sometimes people want to ask about disasters or experiences with law enforcement or PTSD, or any number of things that have the potential to possibly be triggering to people. So just be aware of that when formulating the questions, and think about how to produce the least triggering questions that you can. Things we don't see a huge amount. I'll skip to vulnerable populations for a second. So vulnerable populations are things like children, minors, people who are not able to give consent for themselves, people in prison, other population groups. We don't see a lot of that as a request for the IRB, but those are much more difficult populations in terms of getting permission to try to collect data from them firsthand. For professional risk, this is an area that gets a little bit gray for folks, but we get a fair number of requests for people who want to conduct surveys within their own workplace. And it might also be part of a workplace project, but they're carrying it over into research for maybe a capstone or something like that. And where it gets a little bit tricky is then if that data moves beyond the workplace setting and out into this more public space in a classroom or for research purposes, and maybe the questions being asked might potentially put the company in a negative light, or put the organization, reveal flaws in the organization, things like that. So it's always important, both from an organizational level and a personal level, that people feel comfortable that their responses will not be revealed individually, and they aren't posing any risk to themselves in answering. So that's a lot in a short period of time, but those are some of the things that, in viewing a lot of surveys that come through, tend to be some of the kind of big ticket items that make it difficult to kind of move the research through the process from an IRB perspective, and may prevent getting really good data sets to work with from the survey, which of course is what we would want, is if you're doing a survey, to get the best data you can so that you can produce the article or the presentation or the thesis or dissertation that you're wanting to do. So I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to turn it over to our librarians to talk about some new resources that we have that I'm super excited about, that provide more background in this area. So I will let Priscilla and Colleen take it away.
Thank you. So Jenny got in touch with us and let us know that they were seeing some challenges with survey design in these IRB applications, and sort of talk through some of the issues they were seeing. And so Colleen and Jason, two of our librarians, pulled together some resources, and luckily we have a fantastic tool called Sage Research Methods, which, if you were here earlier, and I recognize a lot of names, so I know that you were, many of you were here earlier. You've seen kind of a preview of all Sage can do. We'll just take a look at some of the key resources that supported survey design here in a bit, because we sort of pulled them all together in one place to make it easy for any of you who are working on surveys to find some help with some of these more challenging aspects. And then if you have students who are working on surveys, you can sort of send them here to get a refresher. It's kind of like a cheat sheet, sort of a cheat sheet for survey design is what we have for you today. So I just want to show you how to get there first. On the library's homepage, we have these menus across the top. The research menu is where a lot of our research stuff lives, not surprisingly. Over on the research basics side, these are all things that would count as research help, tutorials and things like that. And Sage Research Methods is tucked under there because it is basically a giant tutorial resource for primary research. But we've tucked this survey design cheat sheet up here under research at APUS. And the research at APUS site is kind of a comprehensive research primer. So it starts at the very beginning with basics of academic research, walks the students through library resources, essentials, searching for web stuff online, and evaluating those resources, and then advanced research skills. And that's all, your secondary research, so literature review research, right? Then we have a section, the second layer for primary research. So these are for our upper level undergrads and our graduate students who are doing their own research, designing their studies, collecting their data, and analyzing it, which is a challenge. So if you click into research methods, you see a lot more detail, and Sage Research Methods is linked there as well. But we decided to pull out this survey design because surveys are such a popular methodology for students in an online school, naturally. So we pulled this out so it's a little easier to find. So that's where it sits. And if you click there, you see that it's very Sage Research Methods focused, because we just have so many amazing resources in there pertaining to survey research. It starts off with a link to the methods map, which we'll go look at in just a minute, but I kind of want to walk you through the rest of the page so you could see how it's laid out. The stuff at the top is very general to research design, just basics of research design. So if you're brand new to it, you can get a great overview this way. You can go into the methods map, which we will shortly. Here's a shortish 5-minute or so video on designing a survey. And then there's some fantastic ebook collections on survey design and then related methodologies, other books besides Sage, because we do have a few things that are not in Sage Research Methods. And we'll take a look at those in a bit as well. And then we kind of try to tackle some of those individual challenges, some of that more granular stuff that comes up when you're designing a survey, like validity and validity as it applies to research design, sample size, and then Likert scales because we love them so much, and then cognitive tasking, so cognitive interviewing. So if you click on those, it'll drop down a little bit of an explanation which is generally for students who just are new to all of this. Like they want to know what is validity anyway. It kind of gives them an overview, but then they can click into Sage research methods. And in some cases, we've even found like a nice tutorial video that they can watch if they prefer to learn visually, which a lot of our students do. So that's what's on the page. I'm going to scroll back up at the risk of making everyone dizzy. I'll try to go slow. We'll take a look at the methods map for survey research. Now, this again is for broad level methods mapping for survey research as a whole. But you'll see when we get in here that what's great about the methods map is it's interactive and it lets you get as granular as you'd like. So the survey map, the methods maps, you'll notice they have the main concept that you're looking at in the middle, and then it'll have a list of broader terms and narrower terms that you can click, and then related terms. So you go in and look at some of these things individually, and it'll change the content link that's up above the map. So you can click in here to look at all survey research, or you can click around into some of these terms, and it will automatically switch around, and you can take a look at some of these more specific things as well. So if I chose qualitative interviewing, for example, it'll rearrange everything, and now we have narrow terms related to qualitative interviewing and broader terms, and so on and so forth. So you can see how this could quickly become a rabbit hole if you're not careful. But for students who are first learning these methods, this kind of prompts them to explore and to kind of catch a lot of different methods they may not have considered. So it's a great discovery tool. It really kind of promotes more exploratory learning, I think. So we love it in the library. It's one of our favorites. But then once you're ready to kind of search, you're finished like playing with the map and making it do fun things, and you want to really dig into one of these methods or one of these concepts, you click the search all content on whatever method you've settled on, and it'll open up all that Sage Research Methods has to offer on that particular method. And it's going to be a lot in most cases, because Sage Research Methods has all these different kinds of content, books and reference things like encyclopedias and dictionaries for quick definitions, data sets, which are really, as we talked about earlier today, they're really more teaching tools. They're like practice data sets where you can play with data to see how to analyze. So it's kind of like getting your feet wet in the whole data analysis thing without your own data, so you're not going to mess anything up. Cases, so you can see examples of research methods in action, like real life cases of how research is done. Videos, which are just fantastic, I think, for students who are really sick of reading off of the screen. So there's just so much here. And you can even see that they can come down and limit by discipline. So if they're studying computer science, they can limit just to computer science if that's what they need to do. I'll keep it at that for now, because I could go in here and spend, as you most of you know, since you saw me earlier, spend hours showing you all the features and things that you can do. I really urge you to go in and explore on your own. But I'll just point out, I'll back up to that survey design page again. When you click the ebook collections, you'll see a slightly different interface. All the Sage Research Methods links that are in here will take you to a similar page. You'll see a list of Sage Research Methods, but they'll be focused on these more granular topics. The ebook collections that we've put together for you are a little bit different. They're going to come from a variety of different vendors, including Sage. But there are some in here from other sources like our Credo reference and some of our individual databases like ProQuest. But all of these are focused on research design. Colleen put this together for us. She's amazing at these.
But I still have videos in there. Oops.
Oh, okay. We like the videos. So yeah, this is like from our everything search. It looks a little bit different, but you click on the title and then you'll find a full text link, and you can get in there and read about survey design. So I'll stop there because we're up on time, but if anyone has any questions, please let me know.
Well, thank you. That was excellent. And I so appreciate the addition of that page and the ebook collections and those tabs that lead into Sage. I think those are enormously helpful. And I would love to get feedback, from folks here or people who are watching this recording at a later time. If you find these resources helpful or would like different resources or additional resources, particular to this method or others, that's really great feedback for us to work with the librarians and try to make the best resources that we can to help you with your own research and with your teaching as well. Yep, so excited to dig in. And Jana, you're one of the people who I know is a survey expert, so we may come knocking to get some additional survey resources from you.
Yeah, sure. Expert, I don't know. Thanks.
Well, thank you everyone for being here today, and I hope you do use these library resources, integrate them into classes and in your own research as well. And please reach out with feedback or other requests as you get going with your own projects or are mentoring your students. So thank you so much for being here, and thank you so much to our wonderful librarians for all that you're doing.
Thanks, Jenny.
Thanks, y'all. Have a great one.
Have a good day.
Toodles.